Welcome to Short Movie Channel. Our movie today begins with three friends, Chris, Alicia, and Daniel. They're in a car, driving towards a well-known forest in Georgia. We learn that they plan to spend their vacation in this forest before Daniel and Alicia's wedding. By the way, they're engaged and about to get married. After a while, Daniel stops the car and steps out to use the restroom. Chris seizes the opportunity to talk to Alicia, telling her that they need to tell Daniel about their relationship because he's marrying her, and he has the right to know. From this conversation, we understand that Chris has been secretly involved with Alicia behind Daniel's back. However, Alicia insists that she won't tell Daniel anything because it would ruin the wedding. She also asks Chris to stay quiet. Although frustrated, Chris reluctantly agrees. Soon after, Daniel returns, and they continue their journey until they arrive at the forest. Once they get there, they start exploring the area. Daniel tells them that this forest was occupied by the Nazis during World War II. Remember this fact well, it'll be important later. They keep wandering around until they reach the top of a beautiful mountain. At this point, Daniel asks Chris to officiate his wedding with Alicia. Chris refuses at first, feeling upset because he loves Alicia, but Daniel insists. Left with no choice, Chris agrees to do it. That night, the three of them set up camp in the forest and start drinking. As a result, Daniel gets tipsy and begins to slur his words. He then asks Chris why he has seemed upset since they arrived. Poor Daniel assumes that Chris is sad because their marriage will create some distance between them. Chris reassures him that they are best friends and that nothing will ever come between them. Feeling grateful, Daniel thanks Chris and heads to bed, and soon, everyone falls asleep, marking the end of the night. The next morning, Chris wakes up and sees a strange man rummaging through his and his friend's bags. He stays quiet, observing him until Daniel and Alicia hear the noise and come over. That's when they realize that the man isn't a stranger, he's their friend David. Alicia explains that David wasn't searching through their bags to steal anything, he was just looking for the camera. Feeling embarrassed, Chris apologizes to David for the misunderstanding. Afterward, David takes out the camera and asks Chris, Daniel, and Alicia to stand together for a group photo. But here's where things take a terrifying turn. David keeps asking them to shift slightly to the right to get the perfect shot. They do as he says, moving bit by bit until they reach the position he suggests. Just as David prepares to snap the picture, disaster strikes. David suddenly realizes that Chris is standing on a landmine buried since World War II. He shouts out in shock, terrifying everyone. He quickly tells Chris not to move an inch, otherwise the mine will explode, killing them all. Then, he instructs Alicia and Daniel to stand somewhere safe, assuring them that he'll head to the city to find help and return as soon as possible. And indeed, he leaves to get help. Meanwhile, Daniel and Alicia start wandering through the forest, searching for a spot with network coverage so they can call the police. Eventually, they manage to get a signal, and Daniel begins talking to the police. This is where things take a crazy turn. Daniel tells Alicia that the police said they have a helicopter and explosives experts, but they're not sending anyone. Alicia is shocked and asks, "Why not?" Daniel continues speaking and tells her that the police won't send help because they don't rescue traitors. At that moment, Daniel lets her know that he's aware she and Chris betrayed him, and that's why there will be no rescue. Then, Daniel takes Alicia and heads back to Chris. Once there, he confronts Chris, revealing that he knows all about the betrayal with his fiancée. That's why he brought him here and made him step on the landmine, to ensure his death. Chris then learns that Daniel and Divya had planned this together, setting him up to step on the mine exactly like he did. At this point, Chris panics and says to Daniel, "What if you're lying? What if there's no mine at all?" Daniel smirks, pulls the mine's safety pin, and shows him that it's real. Now, Chris is truly standing on a live mine. If he moves, he'll be blown to pieces, literally. Daniel's madness continues. He grabs a shovel and hands it to Alicia, saying, "Listen up, girl. There's no signal here, which means no one's coming to save you. So, dig a nice trench next to Chris. Make him jump into it. Maybe he'll survive the blast, or maybe he'll die. Either way, that trench will be your grave because you both deserve it. But Daniel doesn't stop there. He takes the safety pin and throws it far away so no one can reach it. Then, he leaves them behind, terrified and hopeless, and walks away. He keeps going until he finds Divya. He takes Divya, and they leave the place entirely, not even bothering to see if Chris and Alicia survive. Even when Divya suggests staying to watch, Daniel refuses and walks away. We then return to Alicia, who is panicking, unable to figure out how to save Chris. But my friend, she doesn't give up. She starts searching for the safety pin until she finally finds it. She picks it up and rushes back to Chris. Chris begs her to leave it to him. He'll try to reattach it himself, but Alicia refuses. She kneels down and tries to attach the pin back into place. She struggles for a long time, but unfortunately she fails. So, she decides to follow Daniel's suggestion and starts digging the trench, hoping Chris can jump into it so the mine won't hurt him. At this point, everything seems to be going as planned, but then a security officer from the park or forest, named Elia, happens to be patrolling the area with his dog. From a distance, he spots Chris standing there with Alicia digging beside him. He senses that something is wrong and begins observing them from afar. The problem arises when, after a while, the dog breaks free and runs toward Chris, which could cause him to move and trigger the mine. Alicia quickly tries to stop the dog, and this makes Elia furious. He rushes toward them, pulls out his gun, and starts threatening them, accusing them of murder. They try to calm him down and explain that Chris is standing on a landmine, and that's why Alicia is digging the trench for him. They plead for his help. At this point, it becomes clear that Elia is somewhat insane. He tells them, "All right, I'll help you, but first, I need to know how you ended up stepping on a landmine because there aren't supposed to be any mines in this area." They are forced to explain everything, how Daniel set them up and the entire situation. It seems like Elia believes them because he starts giving Alicia a suspicious look. They ask him again if he'll help them or at least leave them alone, but Elia makes it clear that he's willing to help, but only for a price. Of course, this angers them, but they agree and offer him everything they have. Elia checks their belongings and finds nothing valuable, just some clothes, so he tells them, "Nope, that's not enough. I'm not helping." Chris then offers all the money he has, but Elia still refuses, saying he doesn't care about money. Instead, he makes it clear that he will only help in exchange for a certain piece of Alicia's clothing. And well, I don't think I need to explain what he meant. They are forced to agree to his disgusting demand. Alicia gives him the clothing he asked for, and only then does the crazy Elia decide to continue digging. And indeed, he starts digging. But while he's digging, everyone hears a radio signal. So, Ilya pulls out the radio he has and answers the person speaking to him. It turns out to be his security colleague, Sergey. After finishing his conversation, Chris and Alicia asked him to call for help. But my friend, the filthy Ilya refuses to do so, unless, of course, there's something in it for him. His demand? Alicia has to walk on her hands like a dog. Feeling humiliated, Alicia does it, despite Chris repeatedly telling her not to. But she has no choice, they need to get out of this situation. After she does what he wants, Ilya hands her the radio. Alicia is about to call for help, but the problem is that Sergey, the other security officer on the line, doesn't speak English. Naturally, Alicia and Chris ask Ilya to translate for them. But Ilya refuses, unless Alicia removes a piece of clothing for every sentence he translates. At this point, Chris completely refuses. But Alicia, desperate, agrees. She starts undressing until she realizes she's about to take everything off. That's when she refuses to continue. They thank Ilya for his so-called help, which was awful, and tell him to leave. But Ilya, of course, refuses. At this point, he's lost all sense of control. He decides he's going to assault Alicia. Chris gets furious and starts cursing him. Ilya shifts his focus to Chris, and Alicia seizes the opportunity to run. But the insane Ilya doesn't let it slide. He leaves Chris and chases after Alicia. In his rush, he forgets his rifle, and Chris immediately sees his chance. Chris scrambles to grab the gun, and after struggling for a while, he finally gets hold of it. At the same time, Ilya catches up to Alicia, holding a knife to her. Chris realizes he can't shoot because if he does, the close range might cause the bullet to hit Alicia, or at the very least, disfigure her completely. Chris hesitates, paralyzed by fear. Ilya takes advantage of this moment and drags Alicia to a slightly more secluded spot. Then, the filthy monster starts assaulting her in front of Chris, who stands there helplessly, holding the rifle, crying in frustration. Once Ilya is done, Alicia tries to push him away. Seeing an opening, Chris finally aims the gun to fire. But just as he's about to shoot, Ilya's dog suddenly attacks Chris, knocking him away from the landmine. The shock is so intense that Chris passes out. The bullet fires but doesn't hit Ilya. Instead, it strikes Alicia. As for the landmine, it doesn't even go off. Hours later, Chris slowly regains consciousness. His mind is foggy as he sees Ilya standing in front of him, talking. Ilya smugly tells him that the landmine was fake and that his so-called friend Daniel had tricked him. He explains that if it were a real landmine, it would have exploded the moment Chris stepped on it. But Daniel had played him, making him live in fear for nothing. Ilya then leaves the scene. Chris, still in shock, sits there beside Alicia, who is lying in a pool of her own blood. He can't believe what just happened. Overcome with grief, he screams at Ilya, "I'm going to kill you!" A long time passes. Eventually, we see Chris in Georgia. He arrives at a house where a woman named Tanya and her little daughter, Lika, live. Chris talks to them and tells them he's from America and completely lost, as he knows nothing about Georgia. He asks if they have a map so he can find his way to another city he wants to visit. Lika, the little girl, tells him she can print a map for him from the internet. Chris is relieved and sits with them for a while. She prints the map and even helps him find the city he's looking for. Everything seems fine. Chris is about to leave but suddenly turns back at the last moment. He speaks to Tanya and Lika again, telling them he's starving and asking if they have any food. They agree and invite him to eat with them. At the same time, nearby, we see Ilya working on his beehives. Once he's done, he heads back to the same house where Tanya and Lika live. Yes, my friend, Tanya is actually his wife. And Lika? That's his daughter. That's right, the insane Ilya is married and has a kid. Ilya enters the house and immediately spots Chris. He freezes, terrified that Chris now knows where he lives. But he says nothing to his family. Instead, he asks Chris to step outside to talk. Chris agrees, completely unaware of what's about to happen. At that moment, Ilya realizes that his wife and daughter have nothing to do with anything and that Chris can come to him anywhere and do whatever he wants. Chris agrees casually and arranges a meeting place with him before leaving. Ilya returns home terrified, thinking about what to do. He picks up his phone, about to call the police, but then remembers what he did to Alicia. Of course, he knows that if the police come and Chris tells them everything, he will be the one getting arrested. So, he drops the idea and keeps thinking about what to do with Chris. Just then, the sound of his dog barking snaps him out of his thoughts. He goes outside, looking for it. At the same time, Chris arrives at Tanya and Lika's house with the dog, which is bleeding. He tells them it was an accident, that he hit the dog by mistake. Naturally, they rush to check on the dog to see if they can treat it. Meanwhile, Ilya notices blood on the road and quickly realizes it's his dog's blood, the one Chris killed. Without hesitation, he rushes home to protect his family. As soon as he enters, he finds Chris with them. Chris keeps apologizing, saying, "I hit the dog by accident." But Ilya doesn't believe him and threatens, "I'm going to kill you!" He storms off to grab his rifle, but Chris reacts faster. Before Ilya can load any bullets, Chris pulls out his gun and shoots Ilya twice in both legs, immobilizing him. And from that moment, things spiral into madness. Chris takes control, tying up Tanya and making it clear that they will follow his orders. He tells them, "You'll do everything I say, and in return I won't kill you." Fear grips them, and they agree. Chris then orders them to carry Elia inside the apartment, and they comply. Now, Chris starts treating them exactly as Elia had treated him and Alicia. First, he forces Lika to take off part of her clothes, just like Elia made Alicia do. Then, he throws those clothes away and orders Lika to crawl like a dog to retrieve them. She obeys while Tanya sobs, asking, "Why are you doing this?" That question pushes Chris over the edge. He snaps and begins talking, revealing the truth, how some time ago, Elia did the same thing to Alicia. He took advantage of the fact that Chris was helpless and tortured Alicia mercilessly. And in the end, he was responsible for her death. Chris explains how he carried Alicia's burning body, running to get her to a hospital. But sadly, due to her severe injuries, she didn't survive. As fate would have it, Elia's wallet had fallen at the scene. Chris found it and easily discovered his address. When Chris finishes talking, Tanya and Lika are left in shock, unable to believe what they've just heard. Elia speaks up, admitting that he was wrong for what he did and telling Chris, "You can kill me if you want." However, he pleads, "My family has nothing to do with this." But Chris isn't interested in killing him. He wants to humiliate him. He grabs Lika again and tells them, "We're going to play a game, just like your father played with Alicia." The game is simple. Chris removes all but one bullet from his revolver, spins the cylinder, and fires. If the bullet goes off, Lika dies instantly. If it doesn't, she gets to live and move on to the next round, removing another piece of clothing. And just like that, Chris sets the rules and begins the game. He spins the cylinder, orders Lika to remove the first piece of her clothing, and when she does, he pulls the trigger. But the worst happens. The very first shot fires. The bullet hits Lika in the head. And just like that, she's dead. Elia and Tanya collapse, wailing over their daughter. Meanwhile, Chris sits on the floor, paralyzed in shock. He never actually intended to kill anyone. He was never a murderer. But Elia forced his hand when he raped Alicia and caused her death for no reason. And that's how today's movie ends. I hope you enjoyed watching with us. Don't forget, if you liked the video, support us with a like and a subscribe.